Good day, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about all things HR and we interview HR practitioners from around the world to find out what are some of the things that we should be thinking about as an HR profession. My name is Dr. Veldsman. I'm really excited today to be joined by Mandy. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Mandy, give us a little bit of context before I introduce the topic, just in terms of JoinPanda. What is it that you do? And then we can really just dive in from there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tita. I think in recent times, we've all been speaking about the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's becoming increasingly apparent, I think, that there's been a silent pandemic that's really been raging through the world long before COVID-19, which is the mental health crisis. And I guess COVID-19, there aren't many silver linings, but the one is probably that it has really lifted the lid on this discussion. So at Panda, we're really passionate about making mental health and well-being resources accessible to all. We think that people just don't get access to care. I think in developing countries, the numbers as high as 23% of people who don't get access to care. So we know there's a lot of work to do, and we really have to tackle that problem.
No, that's fantastic to hear that. And I think such a relevant topic. And as you've rightfully said, I think that's one of the silver linings out of COVID, that it raised the awareness pertaining to, but what are we doing around mental well-being? What are we doing about well-being within organizations? Because well-being has largely, unfortunately, been a bit of the forgotten stepchild in a lot of organizations, right? It's just managed by someone somewhere, as opposed to necessarily being a core strategic focus, which we're finding that as well. So I think in celebration and as part of this series as well, with regards to Global Mental Awareness Month in October, I think this fits really, really well with our conversations to say, but what is the current state of mental well-being and what is it that we can do? And I'd love you to share some of the lessons that you've also learned with engaging with people with regards to the accessibility of services. In preparation for today, a couple of things that stood out for me was really the point that you've already made. I think it's according to the World Bank that stated that in low-income countries, 75% of mental well-being disorders go untreated. And that's largely due to stigma, and it's due to the accessibility pertaining to that. So, Mandy, give us a bit of a view. What is the current state with regards to, and what are you seeing in terms of mental well-being?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think you're spot on. The World Health Organization have said that, poor mental health actually costs the global economy over $1 trillion a year. So I think as we discuss this, you'll see that yes, it's the right thing to do to invest in your employees' mental health, but it's actually good for business as well. And that's okay because it's actually great. It's a win-win. So to your point of what HR professionals need to be focusing on, I think HR plays such a key role and, in actually becoming business drivers, and they need to see it that way and start moving away from kind of this wellness department that sits somewhere and is almost a checkbox exercise, like, yes, we do something for our employees and that's good enough, to really looking at the data behind, this crisis and what it's costing their companies. So we know that absenteeism is a problem. We know that presenteeism is a problem. Look at what that actually costs your company. And when those things lead to resignations and staff turnover, it's really a compounding effect, because then you go into recruitment costs, then you go into onboarding costs, then you go into, all these people that were there have lost, what you call organizational memory. So you need to bring these people up to speed. It really becomes like, this very expensive cycle. And you see more and more, especially the younger generations, they look at factors like, what does your company do for my mental well-being? And so I think it's really important to start investing in solutions that aren't checkbox, that give you actionable insights, and that really help you ultimately drive good business outcomes.
I think that's a very important point, right? I think there's definitely been a shift with regards to, and, for lack of a better term, let's call it moving from only wellness to a much more holistic perspective on well-being in organizations. That includes, a lot around mental well-being, social well-being, the structures in place, financial well-being, physical well-being, etc. I do think where you are right is traditionally, in my experience, even though sometimes with good intention in organization, there hasn't been resource on the one end, or there hasn't necessarily been, I think, a variety of services to tap into with regards to giving people access to good, solid, scientific mental well-being resources where they can help themselves as part of that. When working with a lot of the members on your platform, what are some of the things that you are picking up with regards to the need that people have? What are some of the questions that people are asking pertaining to mental well-being?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, because I think really the biggest thing that we've noticed is that health and well-being is now a daily struggle for people. It's not really this thing that, like, there's been an accident or a loss in my family, and so now I have a problem. It's actually that people are struggling with the day to day, and that spaces that are constructive and, really productive to getting you to develop in your mental health journey and almost see your mental health the same way you would your physical health haven't typically existed. So I think, to your point earlier as well, it hasn't really been this wellness department's fault. And I think that technology coming along has changed the game a lot in providing access, and in the way that, people can interact across borders, and in the way that it really gives you the ability to connect with people, or at least how we've approached it, to connect with people going through similar things to you, because mental health is such a lonely journey. So I think that's a big thing that we've seen out of the app. It really creates that community, because often what happens is that people get to this extreme state, they potentially get admitted to a hospital, and they go through this intervention. And the readmission rate in hospitals, I think globally, is also shocking. The hospitals can't cope. We believe largely, and one of our co-founders is really the driving force behind this, Alan Swaden, who built the Kesa Hospital Group in South Africa, that the group therapy and the ability to really connect with people going through similar things to you. So in the Panda app, it's not considered therapy, but it's psychoeducation, our key functionality, which really brings people together, allows you to learn more about what it is you're going through, but also gives you that sense of community and not that feeling like, oh my gosh, it's only me going through this.
Mm. And I think that's in the current working environment, especially with a lot of organizations experimenting with remote work. I think that sense of community and that sense of belonging, and to do so in a very safe environment. Because I think what sometimes used to happen in organizations as well, just due to the stigma associated with mental health, was, I know I need help, but I don't want help here. If you look at rates at the moment of employee assistance programs, the general uptake is less than 10%, and there's nothing wrong with the program. It's almost what leads towards that. And it's been a very reactive, responding type of approach, I think, with regards to mental well-being. People get referred, people get put into the network, people get monitored once we think something is not quite right there, in terms of how they are coping and dealing with their external circumstance. I love the idea of community, because I think that's a very, very important conversation. And can you share some of the insights that you've had on the Panda community and how they've engaged? I know, maybe somebody listening today, I'm sure there's been people that have been extremely hesitant to join and to participate in the community. What have you done to help them bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I think, we believe, like you said earlier, that a massive reason that people don't get help is stigma. And the other two reasons that we believe people don't get help is because of cost and not knowing how to enter the system. And I'm going to quickly touch on those things, because I think they're all linked together. So from a stigma perspective, firstly, when you sign up your profile in the Panda app, you don't have to give your real name. You can if you want to. But, the great thing about that is that when you go into these sessions, you can interact, and if it's Kung Fu Panda or Sunflower, whatever you've set your name up, people don't need to know that it's Mandy who's struggling with, with XYZ. And then from a cost perspective, it kind of speaks to point number 3, that when it comes to mental health, people just don't know how to access the system. So if you think about your physical health, whatever it is that goes wrong with you, whether it's the common cold or you sprain your ankle, you break something, your brain immediately knows where in the system you need to go. Is it a GP? Is it the hospital? Is it a biokineticist? But it's not the same for mental health, right? You just don't know where to go. So I think what we've seen in the Panda app, and really how we built it this way, but the idea is firstly that you sign up with your nickname, you come into this kind of low barrier to entry environment, which is called the Forest, which are these live audio only sessions that create community, and they run 12 hours a day, 365 days a year. And because you don't have to interact as your real name, what really holds you back from texting through a question to say, like, I really can't cope with being a working mom. Like, it's too much. I feel like I'm failing on all ends, and the discussion goes, and you have other moms going through the same thing. You all of a sudden don't feel like you a failure, wow, this is not just me that's struggling with it. What are the small things that other people in my group do to, improve every day? What does the professional who's facilitating the group kind of think? And I think that's like the really special part of it, and what we've seen. People who ordinarily wouldn't get help for what they see as just a a daily struggle. It's not depression, it's not anxiety. And yes, those groups exist for those things, but it's actually the day-to-day things that we're struggling with that when we don't deal with them become depression, anxiety, and so on. So I think that's, the special part that we've really seen in the app.
And I think that also helps with is just very old stigma is that people have this perception that I'm either well or I am unwell. And those are kind of the two states, whereas opposed to, well-being is a continuous journey that fluctuates and I'm continuously shifting depending on circumstance and things that happen to me as part of that. And I think people struggle to understand that all of us go through traumatic experiences. And I'm not talking about things that sit outside of the normal day to day. Becoming a parent, as much as that's joyful on the one side, it's also extremely scary. And there's a lot of ambiguity with regards to that, changing jobs, changing location. And I think people need to start understanding that there's a proactive component to managing your own well-being and getting the support that you require beforehand and in the moment. And I think these conversations help a lot just to give that context with regards to that. I think your other point that you made that I absolutely love is I think there is, in a controlled environment, I think in a moderated environment, I think there's a lot of power in anonymity to be able to really authentically engage. You made the point a lot earlier around the opportunities for HR with the technology space. And I think this is definitely one of those. We need to have these conversations around, beyond teletherapy or whatever you want to call it, or tele sessions, etc. What else can we do in future? Because I think it actually opens up a lot of great opportunity for real meaningful engagement as
Really
part of
does,
that as well.
and it really empowers the HR professional. So, what we do is after you sign up your profile, you need to select certain keywords through the app. And then we'll go back to business, and your personal data is always protected by Panda, and any mental health professional you see is obviously governed by medical law. But we'll go back to companies on an anonymous, aggregated basis and say to them, for example, this has been actually a real insight we had recently, where a top company in South Africa, 48% of their employees said that they were struggling with goal setting. I mean, that is a beautiful insight for an HR professional because it's so easy to fix if you know that it's a problem. It's good for the individual. They'll be less stressed. It's obviously off the back of the fact that there's no work-life balance after COVID. It's work-life integration, and people don't know whether they're coming or going. That just, it is what it is. We haven't been able to set up these 5, 6, 7 p.m. boundaries anymore. It's just all one thing, So it would be good for the individual. And how great is it for your company if people know what to prioritize and know how to work through those overwhelming kind of task lists? So I think that, investing in the right platforms is really empowering for HR. It moves them from, the position of trying to get that data, trying to understand, to actually being in a position of power and action orientated. So yeah, we're really excited about that on the insight side and how it makes a difference to the people in those businesses.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, something that we try to drive really hard as AIHR is evidence-based and data-driven insight, because I think that's very often the misconception that a lot of people have about human resources is that it's not a data-driven practice. It's all about people. Yes, it is, but it's about people in the context of, and there's numerous data points available if you utilize them in the right way. I think secondly, what you're saying is, I think it is really about insight and understanding who the human beings are within your organization and what are they going through. And I'll use an example of an organization I engaged with recently where just by understanding the life stage and the career stages of their people, they could typically start predicting what was starting to happen and what's going to be more and less important for that employee from a support perspective that they could actually look at proactively. But I think it is about stepping up and making sure that this becomes a strategic imperative when you talk about well-being, is to talk about it in the right way and in the context of your business, and utilizing some of those data-driven insights as well. Mandy, talk to us a little bit around what do we need to be aware of in the mental well-being space? Because I think there's still a lot of misconception around that people have pertaining to, there's kind of, call them kind of the well-known words that we hear whenever we talk mental well-being, and depression, anxiety, etc. But surely it goes much broader than that.
Yeah, it really does. I think, to my earlier point, that it's just become this common everyday thing that people are actually struggling with on some form of scale. I think the recent stat is that 1 in 4 people at least are struggling with their mental health. And so I think, again, just being so alive to the fact that we need to start making time for our mental health the same way we would our physical health, and the biggest problem with that is that people are time poor. And the next biggest problem is, when you start investing in your physical health, the results are visible to everybody around you. They're visible to you. So we need to figure out how people start to prioritize the things that really matter to the inside. We unfortunately live in this time where everything is so externalized and, about showing all these things. But, I think leaders need to also become much more tuned to noticing those small things, when someone in your team member looks to be struggling, really driving the conversation and changing the narrative around mental health, because that's the only way we'll eventually move this, the stigma needle. Because if someone in your team, God forbid, does cancer, everyone rallies around them, and how will we support them? And it's okay to give them a promotion and we'll support them. That's the narrative, right? But if they have depression, it's like this thing like, oh, they can't cope. And, it's really not true. If they have the right support around them, and it's not the scary thing for them to have to deal with on their own, I think we really can move the needle. But it's as they say, it's one leader at a time. One of the really exciting things we do as well when we feedback that data and the things that are affecting your employees is we often have the corporate CEO or partner or head of HR come in and host a session in the forest on that topic that people say that they're struggling with, and share their personal journey. Because often you look at a person in a place of success and you think like they must have had this perfect journey in life, but it's been really, really incredible to see these high-powered individuals come in and say, at this point in my career I was facing depression, or this is how I worked through like the financial stress around being the first person in my family to have a job, and I still made it here today. And it gives people, again, the opportunity. So it'll be a closed group. It'll be just for your company, whatever your company is called. I nearly gave away a great one we did today, but they had a leader come in and share really, really personal stuff, and the people could come in as their nickname still. So I might not be comfortable coming into your office, Dita, and saying, like, I'm really struggling with XYZ and I just don't know how I'm going to get through this stage of my career. But because I can be there as my nickname, really opens that access to people you wouldn't normally have this conversation with. And again, I think seeing your leaders in a somewhat vulnerable light, I think before COVID, it really, and I was guilty of it as well, but you were almost rewarded for being that person who leaves their baggage at the door and comes in strong and gets it done no matter what, and we couldn't really leave our stuff at the door during COVID because it was on Zoom and running through your study if it's a kid, or and so I think again, that's been somewhat good to break down those barriers. And at the end of the day, just realize if you want to get the most out of your people, you need to treat them like human beings, I think, at the end of the day, and not resources.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's also this, big movement at the moment towards human-centric organizations. I think organizations are still struggling a little bit with regards to what does that mean, because it does not mean that you're not productive. It does not mean that you are not, kind of have good, healthy stress in the organization and driving performance and driving a culture of performance. But I think you've also touched on something else that I think is really sometimes underestimated around the fact that when we are developing leaders, especially from an HR point of view, we need to start thinking about what are these behaviors that we want to instill in our leadership frameworks and in our leadership models that go beyond, the traditional competencies that we talk about, like setting direction and giving good feedback, managing conflict. I think it's a lot more around how do we tap into that kind of empathetic side of leadership as well, to be able to really see people for who they are and see them in their context and manage that, I think, in the right, in the right relation. And I think we don't spend enough time in organizations educating leaders and managers that well-being is part of what you do. It's not the only thing you do, but it has to be part of what you focus on.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you'll know from One Young World as well that, it is, well-being is actually one of the sustainable development goals. And I think what often gets left behind is mental well-being. And we need to start seeing that as really part of the bucket, especially with the really alarming stats.
No, I agree. I think it's almost one of those things that, it's not if you want to, it's if you have to. It is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I think as organizations there as well. Mandy, I want to ask a question based on, and we've touched on technology a little bit, that it gives access. There's some, great stuff happening there in terms of giving people anonymity so that they can engage. Let's flip the coin a bit and talk about what are some of the risks associated with the mental well-being space if it is not well managed. What have been some of the, and let's call them horror stories for the moment, that you've seen or that you've heard of that we need to watch out for?
So, I mean, I think you're right. Technology comes with pros and cons, and we've been really lucky. I must be honest. We have about 1,000 different responses to, what if, because it is a sensitive topic, and you need to know what you do in these situations, right? And so, again, what technology enabled for us in the app is to remove what we call bad actors. If there happens to be someone who's entered for malicious intent, the host can remove that person. But I think what has been great to see, and I guess the long term will still have to prove itself out, but people haven't really been, and please don't attract anyone out, but they haven't been malicious in the space.
Yeah.
People are quite
Yeah,
respectful of the space, so far. And I guess, what are they really going to come in and kind of try to do the bad side of it? But that we definitely had to build for that and had to think it through. You can't also be in a position where you're giving out advice and you aren't qualified to give it out on serious topics. So that's why currently all of our sessions are moderated by mental health professionals. So we do have people who host sessions who share lived experiences, because I think that's also sometimes really empowering and important. Sometimes it's more valuable to hear from a mom who's had a special needs child and who has lived through that, but there'll always be a professional in the session at this point. It's really moderated, because to your point, really sensitive and kind of dangerous space to not have your guards well up.
Yeah, and I think it's a good consideration. And it's like with anything, there's always a light and a dark side with regards to that. But I think it's good for HR professionals to be aware of the fact that technology opens up this opportunity to create safe spaces, but do so in a responsible way. And it's the same when we engage on learning platforms. It's about curation. It's about making sure that there is somebody there that is able to provide the relevant support, and somebody that is actually trained with regards to that. And I think it brings us to a topic of, I think very often the HR business partner in organizations are expected to be a first responder, emergency worker. We need to do a lot more, I think, to enable HR as well to be, to find their feet in the well-being conversation, because I think it is something that's also scary to them. And, then they become a bit of a post-box service, just in my experience. And then I don't think that's the right way to think about well-being in the organization either.
Yeah, 100%.
Mandy, let's talk a little bit about, and this is the debate, and I'd love to hear, the organizations that you're working with. I think you did an excellent job at the beginning to talk about the financial benefit of investing in well-being. It translates into a whole bunch of things. There's this big debate at the moment that a lot of people still perceive well-being and productivity, the relationship between the two, a lot of people are quite unsure of. A lot of people say, if we're pushing well-being, productivity is going to suffer. Other people are saying if we push productivity too much, well-being is not going to be in place as part of that. What is that conversation like with some of the clients that you have when you give feedback around what's really happening in their organizations?
Yeah, very, very interesting and really on the mark, because we believe, our thesis is really that the more you invest in well-being, the more return you have. And there's actual research on this. I think it's for every $1 invested, there's a $4 return. So again, I would go back to, looking at, well, the current system is evidently broken. Add up those costs that we spoke about your absenteeism, about your estimated presenteeism, the recruitment, the onboarding, and look at the systems you have in place that are there really at those moments of distress rather than proactive. And you kind of know that something has to change. And I want to say it's not the current systems or the traditional systems' fault. They ran businesses in their times that were right for their times. But what happened was that they were, I think, unconsciously kind of misaligned to their clients ultimately. Because if you think about a traditional system, which will be a call center, the more calls you get, the more costs increase, the more you have to build out your cost center. And so they aren't naturally aligned to their clients to really drive up utilizations. Whereas with technology, the platform is built, things like our forest, the content assessments, whether 10 people use it or 10 million people use it, we actually want 10 million people to use it. And so the unique thing there is that, generally, whether it's mental or physical, whatever health, the more you use something, the more expensive it is. The more you see the physio, the more you see your psychologist, it's more and more expensive. That's just the way it is. But, I think that's the beauty of the forest, that, unless you are at that stage where you have something clinical and, the forest and these things should not replace that kind of care, but you're just going through these day-to-day things, it doesn't get more expensive. You actually benefit the more you use it. And again, you have this kind of virtuous win-win situation.
I love that. I love the fact also that I think because we have to change our perspective, right, completely on well-being. And I think you're absolutely right. The old systems were set up in a very different time, and the way that we work and the way that we engage with content and with the world around us has changed significantly. And we need to start looking at how do these different things complement and I'm going to call it from the human being as the consumer perspective, as opposed to the organization as the provider, because I think that's been the mistake that we've made for quite a bit, right? It's about how do I, as the organization, provide access to the services, as opposed to saying what's the real need that my human beings have, and how can I create multiple channels through which they can access, the necessary support, the necessary education, and that we can utilize really as part of that. And I think that's a great shift that we're seeing. I also believe HR professionals, the accessibility just of services, like Panda, I think that's really changed the game, with regards to being able to, doesn't matter at what point you are in your growth journey as an organization, but being able to offer this to your employees as well. Because I definitely think, very traditional employee assistance programs are usually associated with kind of medium to large scale enterprises and organizations that can afford to provide that to their people. And I think that's no longer good enough. I think everybody's got the right to have access to the right services within the context within which they work and operate.
100%. As companies see the retention ratios increasing and the absenteeism, presenteeism going down, those are real cost savings. They're not this made up, number. And then you can also look at your employees once again and say, mental health is complex. It's not one size fits all. I think at Panda, we've done quite a good job of trying to, cater for people across the range of, something from less severe to more severe. But, maybe there's, a specific mindfulness, they're great mindfulness apps out there, but they're expensive. They're often very expensive and but if you have just saved $1 million or something because, through investing in your employees' mental health, you've improved all those stats we were talking about, then all of a sudden there is a pool to spend on this. And once again, it's like building a business, right? You make money, you invest money, you make money, you invest money, and so it goes on. So yeah, we really believe that that's where it's going if played properly.
No, I definitely agree. And I think it is also, we had a question in the community the other day around, where does something like well-being need to sit within an organization and who needs to run that? And I think it really, the statement that you've just made, it needs to sit someplace where we are making key business decisions about people, which, yes, it is within HR, but it's not hidden away. And I'll say this very respectfully as a fellow HR practitioner, it's not hidden away somewhere in a, health and safety portfolio, because I think that's just got a very different flavor and a very different purpose in terms of how these things need to play out. Mandy, before we wrap up, if I'm an HR professional and I want to get started, what's the first thing that I need to do?
You're speaking to the right person. That's the good news. But really, yeah, if you are an HR professional, I would love to connect with you. I mean, I think we've worked with enough companies now to also work out almost a secret sauce formula to get people onboarded into the app and to really start driving engagement, because that's often the hardest part, really getting people to take that first step. And we walk through that journey with our customers. It's very personalized. It's very data-driven. And like I said, I think today that session that we had with a big corporate in South Africa and how many people were in there, we really realized like this is working. We thought this would work, but like this is working. So yeah, as an HR professional, whether you're in South Africa or abroad, we can definitely have the discussion and see what works in your specific environment.
Perfect. Mandy, is LinkedIn the best place to find you and to follow a lot of the great work that you're doing as part of Panda?
That's perfect. Or you can just email me on mandy@joinpanda.com.
Perfect. Mandy, thank you very, very much for your insights and sharing, I think, your perspective on an extremely important and a very, very relevant topic for our particular audience as well. Just personally, a couple of takeaways for me that you mentioned that I think sparks a lot of really good ideas and thoughts in the HR domain. The first one, technology is opening up so many new doors that we can utilize to give people access. It's also opening up the conversation around providing people with options of how they want to engage and how they want to be helped. I think we still need to work around, what is the stigma associated with mental health? There's a real business case if we delve into the data-driven numbers that we can utilize And I think lastly, I think the comment that you made around the fact that mental well-being, becomes a core pillar in a strategic conversation for any HR professional that wants to think about both their people and the productivity of the organization. And it's not a one size fits all. It does have to be customized with regards to that as well. Mandy, from my side, thank you very, very much. Really and thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and continue the great work that you are doing as part of Panda. And I hope to chat to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Tita, and thanks to the community.